Deliveries use the back entrance, sir. Emily Carter's voice sliced cleanly through the polished marble lobby of Bennett and Rowe Financial like a blade dragged across glass. The words were calm, professional even, but loud enough for nearby employees to hear. Loud enough for the silence afterward to feel deliberate. Darius Coleman stopped walking. One hand rested lightly on the worn leather handle of his briefcase while the other remained tucked inside the pocket of his charcoal coat. Rainwater still clung to the shoulders of the fabric from the cold Manhattan drizzle outside. For a second, nobody moved. The revolving doors behind him spun slowly to a stop. Somewhere near the elevators, a phone rang once before being quickly muted. Emily looked up from the reception desk with practiced impatience. Her blonde hair was pulled into a perfect knot, not a strand out of place, her silver nameplate reflecting the white lobby lights. She gave Darius the same tight smile people used when they wanted someone gone before creating a scene. Loading and service access are around back, she repeated, this time pointing toward the side hallway without actually looking at him anymore. Darius blinked once, slow and measured. I'm not making a delivery, he said quietly. His voice wasn't defensive. That almost made it worse. Emily finally raised her eyes fully toward him, scanning him from head to toe. The old briefcase. The scuffed shoes darkened by rain. The coat that looked expensive once, years ago maybe, but no longer. Behind Darius, two young analysts stepped through the lobby security gate carrying coffees and laptops. One glanced toward the exchange, then immediately looked away. The other smirked faintly. Emily tapped a manicured finger against the desk. Do you have an appointment? Yes, Darius answered. With Richard Bennett. That made her pause for exactly half a second before the smile returned sharper than before. Mr. Bennett's schedule is booked weeks in advance. He's expecting me. Emily let out a soft breath through her nose, the kind people used when humoring someone difficult. Sir, I really need you to use the proper entrance if you're dropping something off. Darius stood still beneath the massive chandelier hanging over the center of the lobby. Warm gold light spilled across the marble floor beneath his shoes, reflecting against the glass walls 40 stories above Manhattan traffic. The building smelled faintly of espresso, leather chairs, and expensive cologne. Everything about the place whispered money. Everything except him. A security guard near the elevators noticed Emily subtly lift her hand. He straightened immediately and started walking over. Darius saw him coming but didn't react. Instead, he calmly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded handkerchief, wiping rain from his knuckles before speaking again. Could you just tell Mr. Bennett that Darius Coleman is here? Emily's expression hardened this time. There it was. The irritation. The certainty. People nearby had fully stopped pretending not to listen. A woman near the coffee station slowly lowered her cup. Elevator doors opened with a soft ding behind them, executives stepping out into the bright lobby chatter, but Emily never took her eyes off Darius. Sir, she said carefully, I'm going to ask you one last time to step away from the front desk. The security guard was only a few feet away now. Darius looked past Emily for a moment, toward the towering windows overlooking the wet gray streets below. Then back at her. Calm. Steady. Unmoved. I think, he said softly, you're making a very expensive mistake. The security guard slowed as he approached, uncertainty flickering across his face now that he was close enough to actually see Darius clearly. The man did not look dangerous. He did not look unstable. If anything, he looked tired. Rain had darkened the edges of his coat collar, and faint silver threads lined the seams near his cuffs. The leather briefcase in his hand looked older than some of the junior analysts rushing through the lobby. But there was something else too. Something difficult to explain. Darius carried himself like a man completely comfortable standing in rooms where everybody else felt the need to prove themselves. Emily either did not notice or refused to. Sir, she said again, sharper this time. You are disrupting the lobby. Darius glanced briefly toward the security guard before answering. "I have no intention of causing problems." "Then cooperate." Her words landed hard against the polished stillness surrounding them. The guard finally stopped beside Darius, shifting awkwardly in his navy blazer. "Is there an issue here?" Emily answered before Darius could speak. "This gentleman refuses to leave the executive in trance." "Gentleman." The word sounded forced now, stretched thin over irritation. Darius lowered his eyes briefly toward the marble floor. White stone with thin gray veins running through it like cracked ice. Expensive. Immaculate. He remembered floors like these from years ago, back when his mother cleaned office towers overnight in Chicago. He used to sit quietly near supply closets after school, waiting for her shift to finish while vacuum cleaners hummed through empty hallways. Men in $1,000 suits would pass by without ever looking at them. Sometimes security guards followed them from floor to floor anyway. His mother used to squeeze his shoulder gently whenever he noticed it. "Do not let bitterness rent space in your heart," she would whisper. "People can only see as far as they have been taught to see." Darius never forgot that. Even after the investment firms. Even after the private jets and boardrooms and interviews in financial magazines. Money changed how people treated him, but only when they knew he had it. Before that moment came, he was still forced to watch strangers decide his worth in less than 10 seconds. The security guard cleared his throat carefully. "Sir, maybe we can verify your appointment upstairs." Emily immediately shook her head. "Mr. Bennett is preparing for the Larson merger call. Nobody gets through without confirmation." Darius almost smiled at that. Larson merger. So the meeting was already starting. Interesting. Around them, the lobby noise returned in fragments. Elevator dings. Quiet conversations. The hiss of steamed milk from the coffee bar near the windows. Yet tension still hung over the reception desk like static before a thunderstorm. Emily folded her arms now, confidence settling deeper into her posture as more employees drifted nearby pretending to check phones or messages while listening closely. Darius noticed one young intern staring at him with visible discomfort. Not mocking. Embarrassed. The kind of embarrassment that came from watching something unfair happen while lacking the courage to interrupt it. Emily leaned slightly toward her monitor and typed quickly. "Name?" she asked flatly. "Darius Coleman." Her fingers stopped. For the first time since he entered the building, something shifted in her expression. Tiny. Barely visible. But there. She looked at the screen again, then back at him. Darius saw it immediately. Recognition fighting disbelief. Before she could speak again, the executive elevator at the far end of the lobby chimed loudly. Heads turned instinctively. The brushed steel doors slid open fast enough to make two assistants step aside in surprise. And then Richard Bennett came rushing out. Richard Bennett moved faster than anyone in the lobby had ever seen him move before. His polished black shoes struck the marble floor in sharp echoes as he crossed the open space, one assistant struggling to keep up behind him with a tablet pressed against her chest. "Mr. Coleman," Richard called out breathlessly. The entire lobby froze again, but this time for a different reason. Darius turned calmly while the security guard immediately stepped backward. Emily's face drained of color so quickly it almost looked unreal beneath the bright reception lights. Richard reached Darius and extended both hands at once. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice carrying across the lobby without him realizing it. "The elevator meeting ran long. I should have come down myself." Darius shook his hand once, firm and steady. "Morning, Richard." Nearby employees exchanged quick confused glances. Nobody had ever heard the company's managing director sound nervous before. Richard Bennett was the kind of executive who made seasoned investors sweat during negotiations. 6'3", silver-haired, always composed. Yet now his forehead carried a thin sheen of stress beneath the white lobby lights. Emily stood motionless behind the reception desk. Her monitor still displayed Darius Coleman's name across the visitor registry. Beside it, highlighted in gold, were two words she had somehow missed in her rush to judge him. Priority client. Richard finally turned toward the desk. "What happened?" he asked quietly. The softness in his voice somehow made the question worse. Emily swallowed. "I was just following protocol." Richard looked at her for several long seconds before glancing back toward Darius. The older man's jaw tightened slightly. "Mr. Coleman has worked with this company for nearly 11 years, he said carefully. "Without him, half the projects on the 20th floor would not even exist." Silence spread outward in waves. One analyst slowly lowered his phone. Someone near the coffee station whispered, "That is Darius Coleman." Another answered under his breath, "The Coleman Capital guy." Darius noticed the shift immediately. Recognition moving through the room like electricity. Not because people suddenly saw him differently, but because they had finally attached status to his face. Richard gestured toward the executive elevators. "Please, come upstairs. Everyone is waiting." Darius nodded once but did not move right away. Instead, his eyes drifted briefly toward Emily. She looked younger suddenly. Smaller. The confidence she wore earlier had collapsed beneath the weight of public realization. "I apologize if there was confusion," she managed quietly. Darius studied her for a second before answering. There was no confusion. The words were calm. Honest. That was what made them land so heavily. Emily lowered her eyes immediately. Richard exhaled slowly through his nose. He understood exactly what Darius meant. Across the lobby, employees began pretending to return to work, though nobody truly stopped watching. Darius finally adjusted the cuff of his coat and started toward the elevators beside Richard. The security guard stepped aside quickly, embarrassment written all over his face. As they walked, Richard lowered his voice. "I truly am sorry about this." "You do not need to apologize for me being underestimated," Darius replied. "But you may want to ask why it keeps happening inside your building." Richard did not answer right away. The elevator doors opened with a soft metallic whisper. Warm amber light spilled from inside the executive car, reflecting against polished brass railings and dark walnut panels. Before stepping in, Darius glanced once more across the lobby. Emily still stood behind the reception desk completely still, one hand resting beside the keyboard where his name remained glowing on the screen. For the first time that morning, she was no longer looking at his clothes. The executive elevator climbed in near silence, smooth and almost soundless except for the faint hum beneath the floor. Darius stood with one hand resting lightly against the brass railing while Richard Bennett adjusted the cuff of his navy suit for the third time in less than a minute. Outside the glass wall of the elevator shaft, Manhattan drifted downward in silver and gray layers, rain streaking softly against the windows far below. Richard finally cleared his throat. "The Larson board arrived early this morning," he said carefully. "Everyone is tense." Darius gave a small nod. "That usually happens when billions of dollars are involved." Richard attempted a brief smile, but it disappeared quickly. "I still cannot believe nobody informed reception you were coming personally." "That is not the real problem," Darius replied quietly. Richard looked down for a moment. He knew that too. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor with a soft chime. Warm recessed lighting stretched across dark walnut walls and thick cream carpets that muted every footstep. Assistants moved quickly between offices carrying tablets, folders, and coffee trays, but conversations immediately lowered as soon as Darius stepped out beside Richard. Recognition moved across faces one by one. Some stood straighter. Others suddenly looked nervous. One young associate nearly dropped a stack of presentation binders before catching them against his chest. Richard guided Darius toward the main conference suite at the end of the hallway. Frosted glass walls framed the room, glowing softly beneath suspended gold lights. Inside, nearly 20 executives sat around a massive black oak table scattered with contracts, tablets, and untouched coffee cups. Voices stopped instantly when the doors opened. "Mr. Coleman," one board member said under his breath, clearly surprised. Another quickly stood from his chair. Across the room, a digital screen displayed fluctuating market numbers beside the words Larson Acquisition Strategy. Darius entered calmly, his worn leather briefcase still in hand. Some of the executives tried not to stare at it. Richard moved toward the head of the table. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "we are ready to begin now." Chairs shifted softly as people sat straighter. Darius took a seat halfway down the table rather than near the front. That alone seemed to unsettle several people. Men used to power usually rushed toward the head of the room. Darius never did. An assistant stepped beside him immediately with bottled water and a fresh folder embossed with the Bennett and Rowe crest. "Thank you," Darius said politely. The young assistant blinked in visible surprise at his warmth before hurrying away. Richard dimmed the overhead lights slightly as the first financial projections appeared on the large presentation screen. "As everyone knows," he began, "the Larson merger determines whether we expand internationally next quarter or freeze development entirely." Numbers glowed across the room in cold white reflections. Revenue forecasts. Risk exposure. Staffing reductions. Darius listened quietly while fingertips rested against the closed handle of his briefcase. Halfway through the presentation, one executive near the far side of the table leaned toward another and whispered too loudly, "I thought Coleman Capital sent teams, not the man himself." Darius heard it. So did Richard. The room tightened instantly. Richard's jaw hardened. "Mr. Coleman requested to review the agreement personally," he said firmly. "Which should tell everyone here how important today actually is." Silence followed. Outside the glass walls of the conference room, rain continued sliding slowly down the Manhattan skyline. Darius finally opened his briefcase, removing a single thin folder while several executives instinctively leaned forward. The leather edges of the case were cracked from age, but the documents inside were immaculate. Richard noticed that detail immediately. Darius handled papers the way some people handled family photographs. Carefully. Respectfully. Like every decision inside them carried human consequences beyond money. Then Darius lifted his eyes toward the massive financial projections glowing across the screen and spoke for the first time since entering the room. "Before we continue," he said calmly, "there is something in these numbers that does not make sense." The room remained still after Darius spoke. On the massive presentation screen, financial projections continued scrolling automatically beside charts glowing blue and white against the dim conference lighting. Somewhere near the windows, ice shifted softly inside an untouched glass of water. Richard Bennett looked toward the screen first, then back at Darius. "What exactly are you seeing?" he asked carefully. Darius opened the thin folder in front of him and slid out a single marked document. No dramatic movement. No raised voice. Yet the tension around the table tightened immediately. Several executives leaned forward instinctively. "Your overseas expansion numbers are inflated," Darius said calmly. "Not intentionally. But enough to become dangerous 6 months from now." One board member frowned. "That is impossible. We triple-checked those forecasts." Darius nodded slightly. "I know you did." He turned the document toward Richard and tapped one section lightly with his finger. "You calculated projected labor stabilization using current shipping costs from the West Coast ports." Richard adjusted his glasses quickly. "Yes. Those numbers are already outdated." A younger executive immediately shook his head. "Shipping contracts are locked until spring." "Not after next Tuesday," Darius replied. Silence. The younger executive blinked. "What?" Darius finally looked up fully. His eyes moved slowly across the room. Calm. Certain. Pacific Harbor Union is preparing to strike. The sentence landed like a sudden drop in temperature. Chairs creaked softly as people shifted. One executive laughed nervously. There has not been any public announcement. There will be. Darius folded his hands together. 72 hours from now. Richard stared down at the papers again, jaw tightening visibly now. How do you know this? Darius paused for a brief second. Rain streaked against the towering windows behind him while downtown Manhattan blurred gray beneath the clouds. Because Coleman Capital owns part of the freight insurance network they are negotiating against. Nobody spoke. The room suddenly felt smaller. One woman near the end of the table slowly lowered her pen. Another executive reached for his tablet with unsteady fingers. Richard stood completely still at the head of the room, processing calculations fast enough to almost see it happen behind his eyes. If shipping costs exploded during the merger transition, the Larson acquisition would collapse under its own debt weight within months. Thousands of layoffs. Frozen pensions. Entire divisions erased. Darius watched realization spread across the faces around him one by one. Not triumphantly. Quietly. Like a man who had delivered bad weather before and learned there was no pleasure in being right. How exposed are we? Richard finally asked. Darius answered immediately. If you sign the agreement in its current structure, Bennett and Rowe absorbs nearly all transport volatility alone. The younger executive who laughed earlier leaned back heavily in his chair. My God. Richard turned toward the financial projections glowing across the wall. Just 30 minutes ago the numbers had looked aggressive but achievable. Now they looked fragile. Reckless even. Can this still be saved? Someone asked quietly. Darius rested one hand against the old leather briefcase beside him. Yes, he said. But only if you restructure before markets open tomorrow morning. The room erupted into overlapping voices instantly. Executives speaking over one another. Questions. Calculations. Panic trying desperately to remain professional. Richard raised one hand sharply. Enough. Silence crashed back down. He looked directly at Darius now, not as a client, not as an investor, but almost like a man staring at the only person holding a flashlight inside a collapsing tunnel. You saw all this before. Walking into the building today? Darius nodded once. Richard exhaled slowly and rubbed a hand across his mouth. Downstairs, employees still whispered about the man at reception. Up here, billion-dollar decisions were suddenly orbiting around him. Then Richard spoke again, lower this time. And after the way you were treated downstairs, you still came up here to warn us. Darius looked toward the rain beyond the windows for a moment before answering softly. Bad decisions cost ordinary people first. For several seconds, nobody in the conference room spoke again. The rain outside had grown heavier now, streaking across the towering windows in silver lines that blurred the skyline into watercolor shadows. The massive financial projections still glowed against the far wall, but nobody seemed to be looking at them anymore. Richard Bennett slowly removed his glasses and placed them on the polished oak table in front of him. The sound was small, almost fragile inside the silence. Around the room, executives shifted quietly in their chairs, the confidence from earlier replaced by something far less comfortable. Perspective. Darius sat calmly beneath the soft recessed lights, hands folded loosely near his briefcase. He had not raised his voice once since entering the building. He had not reminded anyone who he was. Had not humiliated anyone for underestimating him downstairs. Yet somehow that restraint carried more weight than anger ever could. Richard looked down at the revised numbers spreading across the table before finally speaking again. How many jobs disappear if this merger collapses? Darius answered without hesitation. Close to 4,000 nationwide within a year. The word settled heavily across the room. One executive quietly leaned back and rubbed both hands across his face. Another stared out toward the rain-darkened skyline without blinking. The merger had always been discussed in percentages, market positioning, shareholder value. But now human beings had entered the conversation. Families. Mortgages. Retirement accounts. Children waiting for parents to come home from work each night. Richard exhaled slowly through his nose. And you still came. Here this morning knowing all this. Darius nodded once. Somebody had to. A faint hum filled the room from the overhead ventilation system. Somewhere down the hallway, a copier machine whirred briefly before stopping again. Tiny ordinary sounds inside a building balancing on decisions worth billions. Richard stood and walked slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. His reflection stared back at him in the rain-streaked glass. Older than it looked under office lights. More tired too. You know what bothers me most, he said quietly without turning around. Nobody answered. Richard kept his eyes on the city below. The fact that the smartest person connected to this merger spent 10 minutes being treated like he did not belong in our lobby. The room remained silent. Darius lowered his eyes briefly toward the polished table surface reflecting the dim lights above. People usually decide what they think of me long before I speak, he said softly. Richard turned back toward him slowly. Does it ever stop bothering you? Darius thought about the question for a moment. Rain tapped softly against the glass behind him. No, he admitted. But my mother taught me something when I was young. The room listened carefully now. She used to clean office buildings at night in Chicago. Sometimes security followed her from floor to floor like she was stealing something. His fingers rested lightly against the edge of the old leather briefcase. One night I asked her why she stayed kind to people who treated her that way. Richard watched him closely. Darius gave a faint smile that barely reached his eyes. She told me bitterness is expensive. It costs more than money ever will. Silence returned again, deeper this time. Not awkward. Reflective. One by one, executives lowered their eyes toward the documents in front of them. Richard looked toward the conference room doors for a moment, as though remembering the lobby downstairs. Emily standing behind that polished reception desk. The hesitation in her face after reading Darius's name too late. Then Richard looked back at the man seated calmly before him and said quietly, almost to himself, we built an entire company around recognizing value. He paused. And somehow we still failed to recognize a person. The meeting stretched deep into the afternoon beneath dim conference lights and rain-darkened skies. Coffee cups were replaced twice. Jackets came off. Ties loosened. Yet Darius Coleman remained exactly the same as when he first walked into the building that morning. Calm posture. Steady voice. Quiet attention to every number crossing the projection screens. The revised merger documents now covered nearly every inch of the black oak table. Entire sections had been rewritten in red annotations based on Darius's recommendations. Risk distribution shifted. Shipping exposure reduced. Emergency liquidity reserves expanded. Richard Bennett had stopped trying to hide how heavily the room now depended on the man who almost never made his way past reception downstairs. If we move pension protections here, Darius explained, sliding one page toward the legal team, you shield long-term employees even if overseas expansion slows next quarter. A senior attorney adjusted her glasses quickly. That would cost the executive side nearly $12 million in bonuses. Darius nodded once. Yes. Silence followed briefly. Then Richard spoke from the head of the table. Do it. Pens moved immediately. Nobody argued. Outside the glass walls, evening shadows had begun creeping slowly across Manhattan. The rain finally softened into mist, leaving silver streaks across the skyline windows. Richard leaned back in his chair and studied Darius carefully while another round of edits moved through the legal team. You know, he said quietly, most investors would have let us walk straight into this. Darius closed the folder in front of him before answering. Most investors only protect money. Richard looked down briefly. And you protect people. Darius gave the faintest shrug. Money recovers faster than families do. The room fell silent again. Even the younger executives who had doubted him earlier now watched with open respect. One analyst near the far wall had stopped typing altogether hours ago, completely absorbed in listening. Darius reached for his old leather briefcase and carefully placed several finalized documents inside. Richard noticed the worn edges again. The faded stitching near the handle. Something about that briefcase stayed in his mind. Finally he asked, "Why keep carrying that old thing?" A few executives glanced up curiously. Darius looked down at the case for a moment, fingers brushing lightly across the cracked leather. "It belonged to my mother," he answered softly. Richard's expression shifted immediately. Darius continued quietly while rainwater glimmered against the distant windows behind him. "When I was 14, she bought it at a thrift store for $6 because she said one day I would carry important papers inside it." A few people smiled faintly. Darius did not. "Back then she cleaned office buildings overnight. Sometimes she brought me with her because she could not afford a sitter." Richard listened without moving. One winter night, Darius continued, a man in one of those buildings asked her to use the service elevator because clients were arriving. The conference room stayed completely still. She apologized even though she had done nothing wrong. Darius paused briefly. "On the train ride home, I asked her why she said sorry." Richard lowered his eyes. Darius looked toward the rain beyond the glass. "She told me something I never forgot." His voice remained calm. Steady. "She said, do not waste your life trying to prove you belong in rooms built by people who never learned how to see you properly. Just become impossible to ignore." Nobody spoke after that. The city lights outside slowly flickered alive one by one as evening settled across Manhattan. Reflections shimmered against the conference room windows like scattered gold. Richard sat motionless at the head of the table, staring quietly at the man who had walked into his building carrying his mother's old briefcase and enough wisdom to save thousands of jobs. Then he looked toward the conference room doors, toward the floors below them, and finally understood something that unsettled him far more than financial risk. Darius Coleman had entered the building with dignity already intact. The people inside were the ones being tested. By the time the final documents were signed, the city outside had turned dark except for the scattered gold and white light stretching across Manhattan like reflections on black water. The conference room slowly emptied beneath the muted glow of recessed ceiling lights. Executives gathered folders, exchanged exhausted handshakes, and disappeared into quiet hallways with the drained expressions of people who had just survived something expensive. Richard Bennett remained near the head of the table long after everyone else had left. Darius stood near the windows fastening the buttons on his charcoal coat while the old leather briefcase rested beside him against the glass wall. Rain no longer fell outside. Thin ribbons of fog drifted between the skyscrapers instead. Richard finally spoke. "You saved us today." Darius adjusted one sleeve calmly. "You saved yourselves. You listened." Richard lowered his eyes briefly. "After nearly throwing you out of the building." Darius did not answer immediately. The silence between them felt heavier now that the noise of business had faded away. Far below the windows, traffic lights blinked red and white through wet streets. Richard walked slowly around the table until he stood a few feet away from Darius. "I spent 20 years building this company," he said quietly. "I thought I understood people." Darius picked up his briefcase carefully. "Most people think they do." Richard let out a tired breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Emily Carter has been downstairs crying in the employee lounge for the last hour." Darius looked over at him for the first time since the room emptied. Richard continued softly, "Human resources assumed I would fire her immediately." "And will you?" Darius asked. Richard hesitated. I do not know. The city lights reflected faintly across the polished floor between them. Richard rubbed one hand across the back of his neck before speaking again. Part of me thinks she deserves consequences. She does, Darius answered calmly. Richard blinked slightly at the directness of the reply. But Darius continued before he could speak again. Consequences teach people where the line is. He paused briefly. Humiliation only teaches fear. Richard stood quietly processing that. Darius walked slowly toward the conference room doors, his footsteps nearly silent against the thick carpet. Just before reaching the hallway, he stopped. Your receptionist was wrong about me, he said softly without turning around. But if you fire her without teaching her anything, then tomorrow she will simply become someone else's problem instead of becoming better. Richard stared at him for several seconds. The words landed deeper than any corporate lecture he had heard in years. Downstairs, the executive lobby looked entirely different than it had that morning. The bright marble floors now reflected softer evening light from the chandeliers above. Most employees had gone home, leaving the building quieter, almost reflective. Emily Carter stood alone behind the reception desk staring at the dark computer monitor in front of her. Her makeup had faded slightly around her eyes. A paper cup of untouched coffee sat cold beside the keyboard. When the executive elevator opened, she straightened immediately. Darius stepped out first, followed by Richard several feet behind him. Emily's throat tightened visibly. Mr. Coleman, she said softly. Darius approached the desk slowly. Not angry. Not triumphant. Just calm. Emily swallowed hard before continuing. I judged you before I even let you speak. Her voice trembled slightly now. And I am deeply sorry. Darius rested one hand lightly against the worn handle of his briefcase. The same briefcase his mother once carried onto midnight trains after cleaning office buildings. He looked at Emily quietly for a moment before answering. You saw my clothes before you saw me. Emily lowered her eyes instantly. The marble lobby remained completely silent except for the distant hum of elevators somewhere above them. Then Darius spoke one last time, his voice gentle enough that it almost disappeared into the stillness. Everybody deserves the chance to be recognized as human before they are judged as anything else.